There are moments in life when love doesn't arrive in the form we expect. Sometimes it limps into our lives, scarred, silent, and forgotten by the world. This is the story of such a love, of a pit bull named Bronx who had every reason to give up, yet chose to fight, not for survival, but for something greater. At Vale Marks, we don't just tell stories, we share truths that touch the heart. This is not just a tale about a dog. It's about healing, about family, and the quiet miracles that happen when someone dares to believe in you. Stay until the end. This one will stay with you. The first thing Bronx learned about the world was that pain always came first. Before food, before warmth, before anything resembling kindness, there was always pain. He didn't know when it started. Maybe it was the first time he was thrown into a ring, too young to understand why the air was filled with growls and the sharp metallic scent of blood. Maybe it was the moment the chains tightened around his neck, forcing him forward as another dog, just as terrified as he was, lunged at him. Or maybe it was when he stopped fighting back, when he learned that struggling only made the pain worse. Bronx had never known a soft touch, never heard a gentle voice calling his name. He had no name, not really. Just a number branded onto the rusty metal tag hanging from his collar. That was what they called him when they shoved him into the arena, when they let the crowd roar and place their bets. He was just another fighter, another dog thrown into the pit for entertainment. His world was a blur of flashing teeth, snarls, and the suffocating weight of bodies crashing into him. Sometimes he won. Sometimes he lost. And when he lost, the punishment was worse than the fight itself. The men who owned him had no patience for weakness. A dog that couldn't fight was worthless, and a worthless dog didn't get to live. Bronx learned that quickly. He learned that the hard way. Every scar carved into his body was a lesson. Never hesitate, never back down, never show pain. Pain was weakness, and weakness meant death. The fights became routine. The fear faded into something cold and hollow. He stopped hoping for an escape. There was no escape. The best he could do was survive. Until the day survival was no longer an option. It happened on a night like any other. The crowd was rowdier than usual, shouting louder, demanding more. The air was thick with sweat, beer, and something more rotten, the sickly scent of desperation. Bronx faced his opponent, a massive scarred Rottweiler with dead eyes and blood-matted fur. The fight was over before it even began. Bronx had been fast once, strong, but tonight his legs felt heavy, his vision blurred at the edges. He was tired. So tired. The Rottweiler struck first. Bronx hit the ground hard, his ribs screaming in agony. He tried to push himself up, but his legs buckled beneath him. The crowd jeered. Someone threw a bottle into the pit, glass shattering near his head. And in that moment, as the world spun and the pain burned through him, Bronx understood. This was it. They dragged him out of the pit, not to bandage his wounds, not to let him rest. There was no second chance in this world. A dog that couldn't fight was a dog that didn't matter. He felt the cold snap of metal around his neck, the heavy chain pulled tight as they led him away from the arena. He expected the usual, the cage, the dark, the hunger. But this time they didn't take him back to his corner of hell. Instead, they loaded him into a truck. The drive was long, bumpy, and filled with the muffled sounds of the city passing by. Bronx lay still in the metal crate, his breath shallow, his body aching. His ears twitched at the sound of laughter, human voices, careless, detached, the voices of men who had never cared about him, never seen him as anything more than a tool. The truck slowed. A door creaked open. Then came the sound of something heavy scraping against the pavement. The crate lurched, and then suddenly Bronx was airborne. For a moment there was nothing but weightlessness, the rush of cold air against his fur, and then the impact. The crate hit the ground with a sickening thud, metal bending under the force. Pain exploded through his body, white-hot and suffocating. The scent of damp earth filled his nose, the rough gravel digging into his side. The truck roared off into the distance, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. Bronx didn't move. He couldn't. He lay there, his ribs aching, his breath ragged. The night stretched out around him, vast and endless. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. The wind rustled through the tall grass. No one was coming for him. The realization settled over him like a heavy weight. He had always known his life was not his own. He had always been at the mercy of those stronger than him, those who decided his worth, those who gave him food only if they deemed him deserving. But for the first time, he was not in a cage. He was not on a leash. He was alone. The silence was almost unbearable. He shifted, wincing as pain lanced through his side. He wasn't sure how badly he was hurt. It didn't matter. No one was coming. He should have been afraid. He should have been angry, but all he felt was something strange, something foreign, something dangerously close to hope. The stars overhead were dim, barely visible through the thick clouds. Bronx stared at them, unblinking. Had they always been there? He had never seen them before. For the first time in his life, Bronx felt something stir inside him, something raw and unfamiliar, a question whispered through the cracks of his tired mind. Was this freedom? Number not yet, but maybe, just maybe, it could be. Somewhere out there, beyond the road, beyond the fields, beyond the cold loneliness pressing in on him, there had to be something more. Someone who wouldn't fear him, someone who wouldn't throw him away, someone who would look at him and see more than a fighter, more than scars, more than the broken thing they had left behind, someone who would look at him and see him. Bronx closed his eyes. If he had to crawl, if he had to drag himself through the dirt and the pain and the hunger, he would. He would find them. And this time he wouldn't fight to survive. He would fight to be loved. It was late afternoon when Ellie first saw him. The rain had just started falling, thin needles of water tapping against her windshield as she drove along the winding road that cut through the edge of town. She was heading to pick up her daughter from school, her thoughts drifting from grocery lists to bills and back again. That's when she noticed the shape on the side of the road. A dark mass, curled up tight, barely moving. At first, she thought it was debris. Maybe a broken trash bag or a pile of rags caught in the weeds. But something about the stillness pulled at her, made her slow the car just enough to get a clearer look. It was a dog. Not just any dog, a Pitbull. Emaciated, motionless, soaked from head to tail. His body was covered in dirt and dried blood, but what struck her most wasn't the scars. It was the silence. The utter stillness in his posture, not fear, not desperation, just waiting. She blinked, hesitating. From the back seat, a soft voice spoke up. "Mommy, is he okay?" Ellie glanced in the rearview mirror to see her 6-year-old daughter, Mia, leaning toward the window, her little fingers pressed against the glass. The concern in her voice was gentle, but it cut through Ellie like a blade. "I don't know, baby," Ellie murmured. She pulled the car over. It wasn't instinct or logic that made her do it. It wasn't safety or planning. It was something else, something quieter, something that whispered, "He's still alive, for a reason." Ellie stepped out into the rain, her boots squelching in the mud. The closer she got, the worse the dog looked. He wasn't growling, wasn't trembling. His eyes opened slowly as she approached, and their gaze met. Deep brown eyes dulled by exhaustion, but not hate. There was no hostility in him, no flinch, no snarl, only that quiet, almost unbearable expression that said, "I know what comes next." She crouched, her movements slow, careful. "Hey there," she said gently. "I'm not here to hurt you." He didn't move, not even an inch. She could see the rise and fall of his chest, shallow but steady. His front paw was scraped raw, one ear torn near the edge. His ribs jutted beneath his skin. He looked like he'd been through war, and maybe he had. From behind her, Mia called again through the crack in the car window. Mommy, he looks sad. Ellie felt something catch in her throat. She glanced back at her daughter, whose wide, innocent eyes were filled with worry. Then she turned back to the dog. Yeah, Ellie whispered. He does. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the half sandwich she hadn't finished on her lunch break. Slowly, she laid it in the grass a few feet away from him. He didn't lunge for it. He didn't even sniff it. He just blinked slowly, as if unsure it was meant for him. Ellie knelt lower, letting the rain soak her hair. Listen, I don't know what happened to you, she said, but if you come with us, I'll do my best. I promise, still nothing. She sighed, then stood and returned to the car. As she opened the door, Mia asked, Can we bring him home? Ellie hesitated. Her paycheck barely covered rent. Her schedule didn't allow for complications. A wounded, traumatized Pitbull was the last thing she needed. But as she looked in the mirror one more time, she saw the dog shift his head ever so slightly, eyes still on her, not begging, not expecting, just watching, waiting. Ellie closed her eyes for a moment and made the choice she didn't fully understand yet. Yes, baby, she said softly. We can try. She grabbed the old blanket from the trunk, wrapped it gently around the dog's frail body, and with slow patience, coaxed him into the back of the car. He didn't resist. Mia leaned forward as he settled in, careful not to touch him, but her smile was wide and her eyes shone with something Bronx hadn't seen in years. Hope. As the car pulled away, Ellie looked into the rearview mirror. The dog, Bronx, she'd name him later, was lying still, his body tense, his breathing slow. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he was no longer alone. And though he didn't yet know it, the moment Mia whispered, He's going to be okay, right, Mommy? Was the moment Bronx's life began to change. Not because he was saved, but because someone finally believed he deserved to be. In the days that followed, Bronx began to change. Not all at once, and not in ways anyone else might have noticed. But Ellie did. She saw the shifts, small at first, almost invisible, like the way he lifted his head whenever Mia came into the room, or how he always positioned himself between her and the front door without making a sound. He didn't wag his tail or bark excitedly like other dogs. That wasn't who he was. But his loyalty was quiet, constant, and deeper than words. He had come into their lives broken, physically, emotionally, spiritually. At first, Bronx didn't seem to believe he was allowed to exist inside the house. He would lie just outside the doorway, paws crossed, eyes alert, always watching but never entering, until Ellie gently coaxed him in each evening. Even then, he stayed close to the wall, choosing the corners, avoiding the softness of rugs or the warmth of furniture. It was as if he feared he might be punished for touching comfort. Ellie never pushed him. She gave him space, time, and most importantly, trust. But Mia, in her childlike honesty, didn't believe in waiting. She loved him instantly. And every day she chipped away at the invisible walls Bronx had built around himself. She started leaving little drawings next to his bowl, stick-figure sketches of him with a big smile, standing next to her and Ellie. She tied one of her worn-out hair ribbons around his collar, declaring it his family tag. Bronx didn't understand these gestures at first, but something about the way Mia giggled when she saw him wearing her ribbon made his ears perk up, just a little. And then came the night when everything shifted. Ellie had just tucked Mia into bed when a thunderstorm rolled in. The sky lit up in flashes, and thunder growled across the roof like something alive. Bronx stiffened, his muscles tensed, and his breathing grew fast and shallow. Ellie watched from the hallway as he paced, agitated, confused, not by fear but by memory. The sound reminded him of something else, shouting, chaos, violence. Then Mia cried out. It wasn't loud, just a whimper, muffled under her blankets. But Bronx heard it. In an instant, the anxiety melted from his body. He moved swiftly down the hallway, nosed open her door, and padded into the room. Ellie followed quietly, standing by the doorway, unsure of what to expect. Bronx didn't hesitate. He sat down beside Mia's bed, his ears twitching, eyes focused entirely on her. When she whimpered again, he let out a low, quiet breath and gently placed his head on the edge of the mattress. Mia's hand reached out instinctively and found the top of his head. Her fingers stroked his fur slowly, rhythmically, and her breathing calmed. Ellie watched, heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Safety. Not because of locks or alarms, but because of Bronx. From that night forward, he slept beside Mia's bed. Sometimes Ellie would find him awake long past midnight, eyes open, alert, as if he was guarding her dreams. He rarely slept deeply, but when he did, it was always after Mia had fallen asleep, and always with one paw touching the blanket. It became their quiet ritual. One evening, Ellie found Mia sitting on the floor next to Bronx, her small hands brushing out his fur with a plastic comb. She was humming softly, and Bronx, completely relaxed, had his head resting in her lap. Ellie had never seen him so still, so trusting. She reached for her phone and took a picture, something to remember, something that felt too rare to take for granted. Later, she sent the photo to her friend Kate with a short message. "I didn't save him. He saved us." Kate replied moments later, "That dog looks like he'd die for her." And the truth was, he would. Their little home wasn't much. Just a single-story fixer-upper on the outskirts of town with creaky floors, chipped paint, and a backyard that needed more care than Ellie had time to give. But within those walls, something beautiful had begun to grow. Laughter returned. At dinner, Mia would tell Bronx about her day, as if he were just another member of the family. She insisted he be part of everything: birthday parties, tea time, even bedtime stories. Ellie found herself smiling more, sleeping better, feeling less alone. She noticed how Bronx would lean into her when she sat on the couch, placing his heavy head on her lap, not demanding, just being. Sometimes she'd stroke the rough fur along his back, letting the silence stretch between them. And she often wondered if he remembered the first night she found him, soaked and shaking on the side of the road. She wondered if he knew how far he had come. The neighbors were wary at first. Pitbulls carried a reputation, and Bronx, with his muscular frame and scarred body, looked every bit the stereotype they feared. But over time, even that began to change. When they saw how he walked beside Mia to the bus stop every morning, how he paused patiently while she tied her shoes, how he never barked at passers-by, just watched with steady eyes, they softened. One morning, an elderly neighbor named Mr. Harris stopped by the fence. "That your girl's dog?" he asked, nodding at Bronx. Ellie smiled. "More like he's her shadow." The old man chuckled. "She's lucky. That dog's got a soul." Yes, Ellie thought. He does. Bronx had found his place, not just in their home, but in their hearts. And though he still carried his scars, both seen and unseen, they no longer defined him. He was more than the sum of his past. He was a protector, a companion, family. And in that quiet little house, among mismatched furniture and second-hand toys, Bronx finally learned a truth he'd never known before. Love doesn't have to be earned. Sometimes it's simply given, and sometimes it saves everyone it touches. It was a quiet evening, the kind Ellie had started to treasure. The dishes clinked softly in the sink as warm water ran over her hands. From the living room, the faint sound of cartoons played on the TV. Mia was curled up in her favorite blanket, drifting in and out of sleep after a long day of school and laughter. Bronx lay nearby, his body stretched out on the rug, head resting on his front paws, eyes half-lidded but always aware. It had become routine, peaceful, predictable. For the first time in years, Ellie felt safe. The world outside their little home might have still been chaotic, uncertain, but within these four walls, she had found something close to peace. Until that night shattered it. A sharp, metallic clank broke the stillness, barely noticeable over the sound of the running faucet. But Bronx heard it. In an instant, he was on his feet. Ellie turned, startled, just in time to see Bronx move, fast, fluid, purposeful, toward the back of the house. His ears were forward, body tense, every sense alert. She felt a chill run down her spine. Then came the growl. It was low, guttural, unlike anything she had ever heard from him before. A warning. A promise. Ellie moved toward the hallway, drying her hands on a towel, her heart beginning to race. Bronx's growl deepened as he neared the back door, and that's when she saw it. Movement. Shadows. A figure forcing the door open, the wood splintering near the lock, and then the door gave way. The man who entered wasn't just a thief. His eyes were wide, wild, red-rimmed with something unhinged. A long blade gleamed in his right hand. He stumbled into the house like a storm, muttering something Ellie couldn't understand. Time seemed to freeze. Mia screamed. Ellie stood frozen in the hallway, paralyzed, her feet rooted to the floor as fear gripped her like ice. But Bronx didn't hesitate. He exploded into motion. With a sound that echoed like thunder, Bronx launched forward, placing himself between the intruder and Mia in a single breathless leap. The man raised the knife, startled by the sudden blur of muscle and fury charging toward him, but it was too late. Bronx hit him square in the chest, knocking him back. The knife flew from his hand, clattering to the floor and sliding under the kitchen table. The man cursed, scrambling to his feet, but Bronx didn't back down. He stood firm, body low, teeth bared, a low rumble vibrating from his throat. Ellie found her voice just long enough to shout, "Mia, get back!" The little girl darted behind her mother, crying, but unharmed. The man turned to run, but not before slashing wildly at Bronx in a last act of desperation. The blade cut deep into Bronx's side. He staggered but didn't fall. Instead, he lunged again, driving the intruder backward, keeping himself between danger and the people he loved. Moments later, the shriek of sirens cut through the night. A neighbor had heard the commotion and called for help. Flashing red and blue lights painted the walls as police officers stormed through the front door and tackled the intruder to the ground. It was over, but the damage had already been done. Bronx stood in the center of the kitchen, legs trembling, blood soaking the side of his body. He looked toward Mia, as if to check if she was safe, and then, finally, he collapsed. Ellie rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands shaking. "No, no, no. Bronx, stay with me," she whispered. Mia sobbed behind her, unable to understand why her best friend wasn't moving. The blood was everywhere, pooling beneath him, staining the tile a deep, terrifying red. His breathing came in short, labored gasps. His eyes, once sharp and alert, were now glazed with pain. One of the officers knelt beside her. "We've called animal control. There's an emergency vet 5 minutes from here. We'll get him there." Ellie nodded numbly, her hand never leaving Bronx's side. "You have to hold on," she whispered to him. "You saved her. You saved both of us." Bronx's ear flicked faintly, just once, as if in response. They loaded him gently into the back of a patrol vehicle, Ellie climbing in beside him, cradling his head in her lap as the officer sped through the night. Her hands were slick with blood, but she didn't care. All she could see was the rise and fall of his chest, slower each time. She didn't think she could pray. It had been years since she'd tried, but that night she did. Not for herself, not even for Mia. She prayed for Bronx, for the dog who had known only pain, but who had still chosen to protect, who had stood tall in the face of danger, who had shielded her daughter with his own body, even when it meant his life. She whispered his name over and over like an anchor in the chaos. "Bronx, Bronx, please. Stay with us." And somehow, through the haze of pain and flashing lights, he did. He didn't close his eyes. He didn't give in. Not yet. The emergency vet clinic was awash in harsh fluorescent light and sterile white walls, a world away from the warm little house they had just left behind. Ellie burst through the doors with Bronx cradled in her arms, his blood soaking through the blanket she had wrapped around him. Her hands trembled, her breath came in sharp, broken gasps. Mia trailed behind her, clutching the sleeve of her mother's coat, her face pale with confusion and fear. A vet technician rushed forward. "What happened?" she asked urgently, her eyes widening as she caught sight of Bronx's wounds. "He was stabbed," Ellie choked out. "He protected my daughter. He needs help, please." Without another word, the staff moved with swift coordination, lifting Bronx onto a gurney, wheeling him through the swinging doors and into the back. Ellie and Mia were left standing in the waiting room, the sudden stillness like a vacuum after the chaos. Ellie collapsed onto a plastic chair, pulling Mia onto her lap and holding her tightly. Her fingers stroked her daughter's damp hair as she tried to keep her voice steady, to hold herself together for Mia's sake. But her heart was spiraling into panic. She could still feel Bronx's weight in her arms, the slow and weakening thump of his heartbeat against her chest. Mia looked up at her, eyes wide. "Is he gonna be okay, Mommy?" Ellie didn't answer right away. She couldn't. The truth was, she didn't know. A few minutes later, or maybe it was an eternity, Dr. Lawson, a gray-haired vet with kind eyes, stepped into the room. His expression was tight, professional, but there was a heaviness behind it. "He's lost a lot of blood," he said quietly. "We're doing what we can, but he's in critical condition. We'll have to keep him under observation overnight. Right now, it's minute by minute." Ellie nodded numbly. "Can we see him?" He hesitated, then motioned for them to follow. The room they entered was quiet, filled with soft beeping monitors and the slow rhythmic hiss of oxygen. Bronx lay on a metal examination table hooked up to IV lines. His side was bandaged, but blood had already begun to seep through the gauze. His chest rose and fell in shallow, fragile breaths. He looked so small, so still. Ellie felt her knees buckle, and she dropped to the floor beside him, taking one of his front paws in both of her hands. Mia stood silently beside her, eyes locked on her best friend. "Hi, buddy," Ellie whispered, her voice breaking. "We're here. We're right here." Bronx didn't move. Mia reached out hesitantly and placed her tiny hand on the paw not held by her mother. Her fingers curled around it carefully, like she was afraid to hurt him. She stared at his face, waiting for his eyes to flutter open, for a twitch of an ear, any sign that he was still with them. Then quietly she said, "Don't go to sleep, okay? You can't leave yet. I still need you." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the way Mia said them. As if Bronx could hear her. As if she believed, with all her heart, that her voice would reach him through the pain. Minutes passed in silence. Ellie stroked Bronx's fur gently, whispering stories, memories, anything to keep herself from slipping into despair. She told him about the day she found him, about how he had changed their lives, about the way Mia had started to sleep through the night again because he was there. "He's family," Ellie said quietly, her voice cracking. Then something happened. A single tear slid down Mia's cheek and dropped onto Bronx's muzzle, and Bronx moved. It was slight, barely a twitch. His paw shifted under Ellie's fingers and his nose quivered ever so slightly. Ellie gasped. "Mia, did you see that?" The vet had been quietly checking his vitals from a nearby monitor. He froze, eyes narrowing. "Did he just respond?" Ellie didn't move, afraid that even breathing too loud might break the moment. Bronx's paw twitched again. Not a reflex, not a spasm, a choice. Mia's eyes lit up. She leaned forward, her voice trembling. "I'm right here, Bronx. Please stay. Please don't leave." And then, another breath. Deeper this time. Less ragged. Bronx's ear flicked, just once, as if in acknowledgement. Dr. Lawson stepped closer, examining the machines again. This wasn't expected, he muttered. He was crashing, but now, he's stabilizing. Ellie wiped her face, tears now running freely. She kissed the top of Bronx's head, her hand trembling. "You're not done, are you?" she whispered. "You're still fighting." She didn't need him to bark, or lift his head, or even open his eyes. That tiny flicker of movement, that stubborn refusal to give up, that was Bronx. That was who he had always been. The room remained quiet, but the atmosphere had changed, no longer steeped in dread, but held together by something fragile and fierce. Hope. Bronx lay still, but not lifeless. He was there. And he wasn't letting go. Not while Mia still needed him. Not while love still held him close. Dr. Lawson had been a veterinarian for over 30 years. He had seen his share of heartbreak, the kind that settled in the corners of his eyes and weighed down his shoulders at the end of long shifts. He had held trembling hands, delivered impossible news, and watched the light fade from the eyes of animals whose owners weren't ready to say goodbye. He knew the signs. He recognized the moment when the body began to give in, when the spark dimmed, when no amount of medicine could outrun fate. And by every measure he had ever known, Bronx should have been gone. The Pitbull had lost more blood than any dog he had ever treated. His heart had slowed to a near halt. His breathing, shallow and broken, came in struggling patterns. His pupils were slow to react. The machines that surrounded his fragile body showed numbers too low to inspire hope. But then, he moved again. A soft sound escaped him, barely audible, but undeniably a whimper. Dr. Lawson turned from the monitor, eyes narrowing. "That's impossible," he whispered. But Ellie had already dropped to her knees beside the table, tears brimming in her eyes. She reached for Bronx's paw, and as her fingers wrapped around it, she felt it. A squeeze, faint, fleeting, but it was there. "Bronx," she breathed. Mia was beside her a second later, still in her pajamas, her small hand trembling as she laid it gently on Bronx's side. The room was silent, except for the soft beeping of machines and the distant rustling of staff moving elsewhere in the clinic. But here, in this small room filled with sterile light and quiet desperation, something sacred was unfolding. "Talk to him, Doctor," Lawson said softly. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Ellie's voice was shaky, but steady enough to find words. She stroked the fur between Bronx's ears, her touch gentle and familiar. "Do you remember that first night?" she whispered. "When I found you in the rain? You didn't know me, you didn't trust me, but you let me wrap you in that old blanket and bring you home. You let us love you." Bronx's ears twitched. Ellie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You were never just a dog to us. You became something more. You became part of us." Mia pressed her forehead lightly against Bronx's shoulder, her voice no louder than a whisper. "You're my best friend," she said. "You can't leave yet." Dr. Lawson leaned closer to the monitor. Bronx's heart rate, though still low, had stabilized. His breathing, though weak, had grown more consistent. It wasn't a medical recovery. Not yet. But it was something. Dr. Lawson had seen dogs fight for survival before, fight through pain, trauma, disease. But this wasn't the kind of fight that came from instinct alone. Bronx wasn't responding to treatment. He was responding to love. He was choosing. Ellie placed her hand over Mia's and whispered, "We don't leave anyone behind, remember." Her voice cracked. "Now it's our turn to keep him here." Mia nodded, her lips trembling. "I don't want him to go." And maybe, from whatever space he hovered in between the world of breath and the world beyond it, Bronx heard them. Maybe it wasn't the sound of their voices or the touch of their hands, but the weight of their hearts calling him home. His paw moved again, not a twitch this time, but a deliberate stretch, pressing softly into Ellie's palm. Dr. Lawson blinked, looking at the machine, then back at the dog. "He's stabilizing," he said. "I don't understand it, but he's holding on." Ellie let out a small, broken laugh, filled with disbelief and wonder. "That's him," she said. "He always holds on." There was no miracle drug, no sudden medical breakthrough, only a dog, battered and broken, whose body was failing, but whose soul refused to leave. Ellie kept talking. She told Bronx about the morning sun that would come through the kitchen window and how it always landed on his favorite spot by the rug. She reminded him of the walks they hadn't taken yet, the belly rubs she still owed him, the squeaky toy Mia had picked out at the store just 2 days ago, still waiting for him by the front door. And as she spoke, the room changed. The air no longer felt heavy with finality. It felt full of something lighter, something harder to name, like the breath you take after holding it too long, like the second you realize goodbye hasn't come just yet. Bronx's chest rose again, slowly. His head didn't lift, but his eyelids fluttered for a moment, like he was trying to find the strength to open them. Mia leaned closer. "It's okay," she whispered. "You don't have to get up. Just stay." Dr. Lawson stepped back, arms crossed over his chest, still watching with quiet disbelief. "I've seen animals survive the impossible before," he said, "but I've never seen one come back like this." Ellie looked up at him, her eyes still wet with tears. "It's because he knows he's loved." Dr. Lawson nodded slowly. "That may be the most powerful medicine we have." As the hour passed, Bronx remained still, but there was something new about his stillness. It wasn't the stillness of someone fading, it was the stillness of someone resting, of someone recovering. Ellie stayed by his side, never letting go of his paw, and deep within that quiet, sterile room, somewhere between the beats of a failing heart and the warmth of 2 hands holding on, Bronx made a decision. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he wasn't going anywhere tonight. Because when you finally found a home, when love wraps around your battered soul like a promise, it's worth staying for. The surgery had lasted nearly 4 hours. For Ellie and Mia, each minute had felt like a lifetime, suspended in the waiting room between prayers and tears, clinging to hope that wavered like a candle in the wind. And then the doors opened. Dr. Lawson stepped out, his face tired but his eyes steady. He gave them the smallest nod, the kind that didn't need words. Ellie's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she just stood there, unable to believe it. Then she sank to her knees and pulled Mia into her arms, holding her tight. Bronx had made it. It wasn't a clean recovery. There was no sudden leap off the table, no triumphant bark. When they were allowed into the room, he was still lying on his side, groggy, weak, with fresh stitches running along his ribs. But his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were open, and they were searching. When they landed on Mia, his tail thumped once against the bedding. It was enough. The days that followed were slow and careful. Bronx needed help standing. Ellie set up blankets across the living room floor, and Mia made little signs to tape on the walls that read, "Welcome home, Bronx," in colorful crayon letters. Friends brought food. Neighbors stopped by with cards and flowers. Some of them had once crossed the street to avoid walking near Ellie's yard when Bronx had been sunbathing in it. Now they asked if they could pet him. He had become something of a local legend. The news story had spread quickly. Pitbull saves child from armed intruder. A reporter had come to the clinic and interviewed Dr. Lawson, who, uncharacteristically emotional, had described Bronx's survival as nothing short of miraculous. They showed old photos of him scarred and broken, and new ones of him curled up beside Mia's bed, weak but alive. People who had once whispered dangerous breed now called him something else, the hero Pitbull. But for Ellie and Mia, Bronx was never just a headline. He wasn't a news story or a neighborhood myth. He was family. Each day, Bronx grew a little stronger. His steps were slow, sometimes shaky, but his spirit was steady. He followed Mia around the house again, not as quickly as before, but with the same unwavering loyalty. He'd lie beside her when she colored, nudge her hand when she cried, and press his nose into Ellie's palm each night before bed, as if to say, "I'm still here." Ellie watched him closely in those first few weeks, watched how he navigated the stairs, how he rested more than usual, how he slept deeply, but always stirred the moment Mia stirred. He bore the weight of recovery with quiet grace, never complaining, never withdrawing. She often sat beside him in the evenings, her coffee cooling in her hands, and just watched him breathe. "He doesn't know how much he gave us," she said to her sister one day over the phone. "It's like he held this family together with his heartbeat." One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees and cast golden light through the kitchen window, Ellie spread out an old blanket on the back porch. Bronx followed her slowly, easing his body down with a soft sigh. Mia appeared moments later, barefoot and humming, a book in one hand and her favorite stuffed bunny in the other. Without a word, she curled up beside Bronx and leaned her head gently against his side. He didn't move, but his tail gave a soft wag, brushing against her ankle. Ellie stepped outside, carrying 2 mugs, hot cocoa for Mia and tea for herself. She settled beside them, watching as the last light of day touched Bronx's fur, now a little grayer around the muzzle, but still as strong in presence as ever. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full. Full of what they had survived. Full of what they had built. Full of the kind of love that doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. After a long moment, Ellie spoke. "He didn't just save us that night," she said quietly. "He reminded us how to love, how to protect what matters, how to hold on even when it hurts." Mia looked up at her mom, then down at Bronx. "He's my best friend." Ellie smiled and reached over to stroke Bronx's head. His eyes closed at her touch, his body completely at peace. "We're his too," Ellie said. "That's what makes it real." The wind rustled gently through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a reminder of the world continuing on. But here, in this little corner of the world, time felt like it had paused just long enough for them to feel whole again. Bronx shifted slightly, just enough to lean into Ellie's touch. His breathing was slow and even. His stitches had begun to heal. His muscles would take longer to recover, but his spirit, his soul, was brighter than it had ever been. He had been through hell. He had been abandoned, beaten, nearly killed. But he had not given up. Because love had found him. Because a little girl had believed in him. Because a woman had opened her door on a rainy night, not knowing that the life she was saving would someday save hers in return. As the sky turned from gold to deep lavender and the stars began to peek through the fading light, Bronx let out a quiet breath. Then, almost imperceptibly, he wagged his tail. Just once, but it was enough, because this wasn't a goodbye, not even close. This was a new beginning. Bronx didn't just survive. He became living proof that love, when offered unconditionally, has the power to bring even the most wounded hearts back to life. To the world, he was a hero. But to Ellie and Mia, he was something more. A quiet presence. A loyal soul who never needed words to say, "I'm here." His scars didn't define him. His courage did. At Vale Marks, we tell stories that remind us of what truly matters. The kind of stories that linger long after the screen fades to black. If this journey moved you, leave a comment and share it with someone who still believes in second chances. And if you haven't yet, subscribing is the simplest way to help us keep these stories alive. Reaching 1,000 subscribers means we can continue creating with heart, honesty, and purpose. Ellie once said, "We don't leave anyone behind." And in the quiet, in the warmth of that small home, they didn't. They stayed. Together. Because sometimes the greatest acts of love happen not in grand gestures, but in choosing to stay, even when it would have been easier to let go.